So happy Wednesday, everyone, and welcome to the first webinar in the series Dataverse in Canada, leveraging an open data repository for research data stewardship. This series focuses on introducing the Dataverse repository and institutional services for use in Canada today. It will showcase a diverse set of presentations related to current use cases and models, including an open discussion panel and best practice guidance related to data curation for ensuring and enhancing the fairness of your data. My name is Jennifer Abel. I am the training coordinator for the Alliance RDM team, and I will be your guide through this series of webinars. And I'd like to acknowledge that I'm speaking to you today from the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Coast Salish peoples, including the Musqueam, the Squamish, and the Tsleil-Waututh nations. In today's session, we are going to be having an introduction to Dataverse and the features you didn't know you needed. Scholars Portal Dataverse is a publicly accessible, secure, multidisciplinary, multilingual repository for research data, searchable from anywhere in the world with servers hosted in Canada. This repository platform includes features such as permanent links, DOIs, that encourage citation of your data set, and allowing you to set licensing terms for access and reuse of your research data. In this session, we'll first briefly introduce the Dataverse platform and explore best practices for organizing your research data for sharing. We will also present some of the key features, tips, and tricks of Dataverse to support your collaborative research project. We'll then discuss the importance of curating data throughout your project to meet FAIR guidelines when sharing your data through Dataverse. A few housekeeping notes before we get started. You have been muted automatically when you entered the room. This webinar is being recorded and the chat may be archived for those who are unable to attend. We encourage you to use the latest version of Zoom so that you have access to all of the features, including security updates. And this may sound familiar to some of you, but if it asks you to update in the middle of the session, maybe wait until afterwards so you don't miss anything. Please use the chat feature if you're having technical difficulties or if you have additional resources to share. And please use the Q&A option to ask questions of the presenters. Questions will be addressed at the end. You may also raise your hand if you wish to ask a question. Questions may be asked in English or in French. We do have a code of conduct as well that we follow in these webinars. We are seeking to provide a welcoming, engaging, and safe community for everyone. Discriminatory language is not appropriate in any venue or platform, and the Alliance does not tolerate harassment in any form, that being understood as any behavior that threatens another person or group or produces an unsafe environment. So please play nice with each other while you're here in this room. And with that, I will turn that over to our moderator for today, Megan Goodchild from Queen's University and Scholars Portal Dataverse.
Thanks so much, Jen. If you could just advance the slide, perfect. That's wonderful. So hi, everyone. I'm Megan Goodchild, and I'll be your host today. I'm really delighted to be here to help kick off this webinar series on Dataverse in Canada. Dataverse is very near and dear to my heart, as many of you might know. I'm the Research Data Management Systems Librarian at Queen's University and Scholars Portal, and I've been a member of the Dataverse team for the past 4 years. I thought it might be helpful just to introduce this webinar by situating Dataverse within the larger Canadian RDM landscape. With the recent release of the tri-agency RDM policy, we're really seeing an increased interest in exploring options related to depositing data in a recognized repository. So Dataverse is really one option that may suit many use cases, and that's due to a host of features that we'll hear about today and throughout the webinar series as well. Focusing on the Dataverse instance that's hosted at Scholars Portal, we're a publicly accessible, secure, bilingual data repository. We provide shared technological infrastructure with community-driven enhancements that respond directly to the needs of Canadian researchers. We also actively contribute to open source software development. For example, internationalization to make the platform available in other languages like English and French. We started as a regional service for OCL, but we've grown into a national service, now supporting 59 institutions across Canada. And we're actively growing a community of practice to help build a support network and contribute to training and outreach materials as well. We have direct involvement and support by academic libraries, and this really drives considerations around long-term stewardship of research data. We've received national funding from Alliance RDM. This is formerly Embryo Portage, which really lowers the direct costs to institutions, and that's really crucial for sustainability. There's low barriers to access for researchers, which in turn helps to more effectively share their data according to the FAIR principles, which we'll hear more about today. So if you could switch the slide, Jen. So today we'll have a window into the world of two librarians who are using Dataverse to support researchers at their institutions, and they'll be sharing the benefits that they've discovered and tips and tricks, resources, and even a demo. It's always fun to see live demos, of course. So Jane Fry is the data services librarian at Carleton University, and she has been serving the Carleton community for over 20 years. Research data management and DDI are her other two main areas of responsibility. She is active in various data communities and working groups, both as a participant and a leader. Jane is the lead for Carleton's Institutional Strategies Working Group and is also on a number of other local, national, and international committees, including a member of the Data Liberation Initiative External Advisory Committee, co-chair of the DDI Training Committee, and member of the National RDM Training Working Group. Conducting webinars, workshops, and teaching are important parts of her portfolio, as is supporting researchers and presenting at conferences. Chantal Ripp is a research librarian at the University of Ottawa with a specialization in data services for social sciences, management, humanities, and law. Prior to arriving at the university, Chantal was the Senior Manager, Data and Repository Services at the National Research Council of Canada. She has a long-standing relationship with the Canadian data community and currently serves as a regional representative on the Data Liberation Initiative DOI Professional Development Committee. So with that, I'd like to pass it over to Jane and Chantal, and thanks so much for being here today.
Thank you, Jen, and thank you, Megan, for that great introduction. So Chantal and I are really pleased to be talking to everyone here today, and we're going to be splitting this into two, but in case I forget to mention it later on, I just want to say it now that for anyone who does subscribe to the Scholars Portal Dataverse, that if you have any questions, concerns, issues, anything like that, the support you get from Scholars Portal is totally excellent. So any questions you have, make sure you send them in. It's Megan who's mostly answering them, and if she can't find the answer, she looks it up for you real quick, but I just want to mention that right off the bat. Okay, next slide, please. So here's what we're going to be talking about in the next little bit. I'm going to be telling you a bit about Dataverse and what it is and some of the benefits. And then Chantal's going to talk to you about using Dataverse for your research data. And then at the end, we have a couple of slides with a lot of good resources for you to refer to afterwards. And I want to mention that any of the information I talk about with Dataverse today in the following slides is taken from that link at the bottom of this slide. Next slide, please. So what is Dataverse? Well, it's a research data platform for sharing, discovering, and preserving research data. So it's a repository for data sets. It is in partnership with Scholars Portal, which is a service of the Ontario Council of University Libraries. And for the subscribing institutions, any students, researchers, faculty, and staff have access to the Dataverse. Next slide, please. There are a lot of benefits. One of them is a robust Canadian storage network. Dataverse is hosted at the University of Toronto, and it is on the Ontario Library Research Cloud, or the OLRC. So this is a cloud storage network, and the beauty of it is that the data is automatically replicated. So all the data in the Scholars Portal Dataverse is replicated a minimum of 3 times across the OLRC's 5 storage nodes across Ontario. So this means that the system keeps 3 copies in the distributed network. So if one of the copies becomes unreadable, a new copy is created from the remaining 2 copies and saved on another node. So you never need to worry about your data being lost. So this provides long-term access and preservation. As well, Dataverse is excellent for data management. This meets one of the requirements in the tri-agency RDM policy for data deposit, data dissemination, and open access where permitted. As well, Dataverse gives you access control, which means you get to determine who has access to your data set. Next slide, please. And there are more key benefits. One of them Megan mentioned is that Dataverse provides DOIs, or digital object identifiers, and citation standards support. Now, a DOI is an international standard for simple, persistent identification for access to your data on the web, and it's automatically provided once you publish your data set in Dataverse. This is really important because some journals are now requiring DOIs for data sets associated with a journal article, and often researchers will simply deposit a replication data set, that is, the variables that they use for analysis in that particular journal article. I should mention here that in the States, this is mandatory for major economics journals, so other journals will be following soon, and this will be happening in Canada also. Dataverse also provides standard and rich metadata fields, so this allows for maximum discoverability for your data sets. As well, Dataverse automatically generates a data citation, and they can be downloaded in various formats. So this is great because they can be used in any research publication, and all you do is simply click the Cite Data button. It can't be much easier. Next slide, please. So I just mentioned about discoverability, recognition, and increased visibility, and this is important because it means that you can share your data with a global research community so that the researchers will get recognition and proper academic credit for their scholarly work. Datasets in Dataverse are indexed in re3data.org. This is a registry of research data repositories, and it has more than 2,400 research data repositories listed. So it is the most comprehensive source of reference for research data infrastructures globally. Dataverse datasets are also indexed in DataCite's global search service and in the Web of Science's Data Citation Index. As well, Dataverse is regularly crawled by Google. And I want to mention here that only published and public files have their metadata harvested. So if you haven't yet published it or it's closed, you don't need to worry about the information going out there. Next slide, please. The next thing to talk about is the file size. So Dataverse supports file sizes less than 3 gigabytes. If it is larger, you can zip the files. If it is a tabular file, you can break it into smaller files. Just make sure you have an accompanying README file within your Dataverse. It is also recommended to keep files to less than 500 megabytes for tabular data files that require more time to upload. For file sizes larger than 500 megabytes, we advise you to contact Dataverse support. Now, there is no limit on the total size of all files you can upload for a single data set. But if you are uploading more than 10 gigabytes in total file size, once again, contact Dataverse support. And I've put a link in here for the Scholars Portal Dataverse guide, and this can be used for more information. I also want to mention here, if anyone is watching today and they aren't subscribing to Scholars Portal Dataverse, this guide is also very helpful to anyone because there's a lot of just common Dataverse guide tips in there. Now, if you're going to be working with big data, then we would advise you to check out further the Federated Research Data Repository, and there is a link there for that. Next slide, please. What types of files can you upload into Dataverse? Well, I've given you a list of some of them, but as you can see, it's almost any type of file that can be deposited into Dataverse. So this just makes it real handy for all types of research. It's not just for quantitative research. Next slide, please. Another benefit of Dataverse is that you can collaborate with colleagues in a Dataverse. Now, the person who has the Dataverse instance has to be at a subscribing institution. But after that, you can be collaborating with any of the researchers. They do not have to be at a subscribing institution. So Dataverse does support groups of researchers working on the same research project. So this is very useful when you're working with researchers at other institutions. You can assign different group permissions, and you can assign different account roles. As well, you can also share your data set with your colleagues without actually publishing it. Next slide, please. So the safety of your data is always a concern. And as I mentioned earlier, Scholars Portal does have backup copies, so you don't need to worry about that. Another thing that you don't need to be concerned about is that you can restrict who has access to your data set. So if you want to have only authorized users looking at your data set, you can absolutely do this. So you can have individual accounts. Another thing that some researchers do is they just put a copy of their research data in Dataverse and use it as a backup copy for their data set that they are keeping elsewhere. Next slide, please. Now, a couple of times I've mentioned a Dataverse and I've mentioned a data set. So I should really explain the difference to everyone here so they understand. When you have a Dataverse collection, the structure is much like the structure of Windows Explorer. I've just found this the best way to explain it to people. So you have a whole bunch of main folders or a whole bunch or lists of main data verses. And within those main ones, you can have subfolders or sub-data verses. So one of the main folders can have a folder or a bucket within it that can have other data verses under it. And they can also have data sets in it. Now, a data set itself must be in a Dataverse. It cannot stand alone. And it contains data files and the metadata about those data files. Next slide, please. So I thought this was an interesting way just to show you the difference and similarities with putting your data into a Dataverse versus putting your data on a website. And I do have researchers that I've talked to about this because before Dataverse came along, some of them were just putting their data up on a website because it was one of the terms of the grant they received that their data had to be publicly available. So 3 things I want to look at here. The sustainability of your data set. In Dataverse, you don't need to have any concern about it. If your data is on a website, you have to keep an eye on it to make sure nothing happens with the website. And it's not a one and done process. You always have to check back in on it. When it comes to discoverability of your data set, if you put it into Dataverse, then you will have maximum discoverability, as I mentioned on an earlier slide. Whereas if your data set is on a website, then you have to make sure when your website is set up that you have the proper SEO or search engine optimization for maximum discoverability. The third thing to look at is the security of your data set on Dataverse. There, the infrastructure is designed to protect against system malfunction, malicious attack, or other technical issues. Whereas if your data set is on a website, hopefully it won't be hacked. However, you can't be absolutely sure about that. So I've had some researchers who want to keep their data set on their website because they've branded their website, they have a really nice logo with it and everything like that. So what I've advised them to do is they can use the Dataverse and the website together. They put their data set into the Dataverse, they get a DOI for it, and the DOI is what they put on their website. And the researchers are perfectly happy with doing that, and that way they still have their own branding. Next slide, please. So you may be wondering if you can test it out before you actually use it. And of course you can. And there is a link here on the slide for a demonstration website, and you can try it out and see if you like its features. Now, how about the cost to use Dataverse for the researcher? Generally, there's no cost for the researcher if your institution subscribes to the Scholars Portal Dataverse. Now, I want to mention that there are other Dataverse instances out there with institutions who have set them up, and subscribing institutions are part of them. So what you have to do is just check with your local data support services to find out more information. But there is no direct cost to researchers. And for the Scholars Portal Dataverse, you have to use your institutional email address to be able to set up a Dataverse. Next slide, please. Okay, so this is the contact. Whoops, somehow I've gone ahead. Sorry about that on my slides. Okay, so still more. How much data can I download from Dataverse? Well, there's no restrictions. It's like going into a data portal. You can download as much openly available data as you want to. Can you upload zip files? Absolutely. Dataverse will automatically unpack your single zip package and present individual files. How many files can be in your zip bundle? Well, less than 500 because of additional processing that is required if there are more files. Next slide, please. So Dataverse does have some limitations, as does everything. And it may not be suitable if your data requires high volume computational processing infrastructure to share or access it. Or if you require an automatic embargoed period, you will have to be the one to manually embargo your data set. Dataverse is also not suitable if you want to upload sensitive data, because Dataverse cannot accept any data that contains confidential or sensitive information. Next slide, please. And the last thing I want to talk about here is about making your data fair. Now, this is just good research data practice, and it's part of good research data management and stewardship. So FAIR stands for making your data findable or discoverable, making sure your data is accessible, that is, it can be downloaded. It's about making your data interoperable, so your data can be integrated with other data and can be analyzed. And lastly, it's about making sure your data is reusable. So that means your metadata and data are well described, so they can be replicated and or combined in different settings. And if you want to find out more about FAIR, there is a link here for a video, and it's only just over a minute long to watch, so it's not a whole amount of your time to watch it. And there is a FAIR Aware link here that tells you much more about the FAIR program. Next slide, please. And now it's over to Chantel for a live demonstration.
Thank you, Jane. And as I change the screen for which I am sharing, I am looking for my web page here. I will just want to confirm. Jane, do you see the web browser? You do.
Looks
Oh,
good.
sorry.
Whoops. I see the Scholars Portal Dataverse
Perfect.
web browser. Is that what you have up?
Yes. Yes.
You're
thank you
ready to roll.
So just before getting started, I am grateful. I am presenting on campus today from the University of Ottawa, and since I didn't have this opportunity, I wanted to say I'm on unceded territory of the Anishinaabe people. And I'm coming to you today as an actual user of Dataverse. So while I am a research librarian at the university and I've had some formal experience with it, it has also served to be very useful for me as a researcher myself. Jane Fry and I have collaborated on projects over the years, and we have a replication data set that supported one of our publications that we had kept in our Google Drive, for which we will be depositing in Dataverse today. So before I engage within the platform, I did want to make note of most of your institutions, or I should suggest contact your institutions to see if they have any guidelines or documentations, if they are a member of Scholars Portal, of how they would support you in depositing. That is one thing I use myself before embarking on this process and depositing my data set, was to consult my institution's guidelines for depositing data in our institutional Dataverse. So I read through them, how to prepare my data, the steps I need to do to deposit my data. And I don't know if every institution has one of these, but do contact your data services and become familiar with what the court is available for you. So yes, this is Scholars Portal Dataverse. And as noted, you can see some of the key features on its landing page and its partner institutions. But as an end user, I'm just going to jump in and go and explore to show it to you. What you'll see at the top here are institutional Dataverses. And I'm not yet logged in, so it won't bring me to mine right away, but I wanted to highlight, you can see them, most of them here. And Jane had made reference to her presentation that there is a demo site. I'm going to open that in another tab. Hopefully you still see all the tabs, and if not, please flag that for me, Jane. So this is the demonstration site that replicates, I think, all of the features that you would have in your institutional Dataverse. And you can see a lot of test files. So I myself have made use of this test demo Dataverse so that I can become more comfortable with the elements of a data deposit. But today I am going to embark on actually a deposit data set in our institutional Dataverse. So before you can do that, you're going to have to log in. And if you don't yet have login credentials, you're going to have to create an account. And there are two ways that you can do this. If your institution has enabled single sign-on, you will see your institution in this drop-down menu. As you can see, I believe there are, Megan noted 59 partner institutions. This list is not exhaustive. If your institution is not listed, you can click this sign up button and actually enter in your information directly like this. And your Affiliation will be recognized via your email. So you'll see here my affiliation is the University of Ottawa. You would continue to create your own username and password, accept the terms of use, and create your account. I already have an account, so I'm not going to do this. I prefer the single sign-on method, so I don't have to memorize another password. So I'm going to go and select my University of Ottawa and continue. And here I am. So I'm actually going to navigate to my institutional space. We are University of Dataverse. University of Ottawa, pardon me. And as I noted, our university has made it clear their guidelines for which they require for deposit. Now, this one may not be the same at every institution, but once you have an account, you should see a button here at the top right that allows you to add new data sets and new Dataverses. Not every institutional hosting Dataverse may allow you to create Dataverses, which is a sub-collection or a sub-Dataverse within your institutional hosted Dataverse. So do ask your institution what their practices or policies are. But for our use case today, I will be adding a dataset. By default, you'll see my host Dataverse is institutional Dataverse. If I had created a sub-Dataverse, I may have my host Dataverse be the sub-Dataverse that I would have created. And you'll have a dataset template that you achieve at. So by default, the licensing for your dataset, as you can see here, is set to a CC0, which is a public domain dedication. And this dedication allows you to facilitate reuse and extendability of your research data. You can still ask for attribution and with the CC0, but it's not a legal requirement as please attribute my data. This is keeping in line with scientific norms, but as you can see in this template, there are other Creative Commons licenses that are made available to you, as well as a custom license. If you have questions around which license best suits your use case, I recommend that you contact if your institution has a copyright librarian or the data support services at your institution. Today, I'm going to attribute a CC0 public domain dedication to our dataset. Dataverse, as noted by Jane, automatically assigns a digital object identifier, which is becoming more and more requested by some journals when you deposit a peer review article for your replication data. And a DOI allows you to create a standard data citation. So that includes a persistent URL and it'll point directly to this data set. So to create a data citation with a DOI, at a minimum, you just need to require the metadata fields that have an asterisk next to it. And as you can see, there's not many with an asterisk. And it's not that onerous, but we will talk about best practices of adding in complete metadata. So today I'm going to create a replication data set for my co-author Jane and I. And if you have any questions on what the metadata fields require, I recommend that you either hover over this little icon here, the person gives you information about what is expected in that metadata field. But as well as, like I said, if your institution has deposit guidelines, they may provide more guidance around what is expected or examples of metadata of what you would find in those fields. So by default, my name is here as I am the one engaging in this deposit, but I can also ensure that it is me, and I would like to add my ORCID identifier. You'll see little icons here with a plus. It allows me to add other authors attributed to this data set. And in grayed out text within the box, it gives you the formats of which to enter the information. So family name, comma, given name, I'll add Jane. Her affiliation is Carleton. Oh, I'm going to spell it right. University, and her email address. I'm going to copy this off a document here. Oh, just the identifier. And her affiliation. Contact information, it could be simply myself, or again, it could come to both of us. And then a description. So the description is a summary describing the purpose, nature, and scope of your data set. I tried to think of it as an abstract for an article. You'd want to give some indication of what that data set is used for. It could be brief or a little bit longer. If you have an associated date with your data set, that can be amended here. And as required, you do need to select from a predefined subject list, a subject associated to your data set. I'm going to use arts and humanities for today. And although not required, I am going to be adding in keywords for which we use in our article to describe our data set as well. So librarianship. And if it's coming from a particular vocabulary like mesh, for instance, you can just define that here. I don't have a particular vocabulary. I will just be entering that metadata. Again, this is replication data set for one of our articles that we had published previously. And so I'm going to add that into here. And I can actually make the reference to the article's published DOI as well. And now those who land on this page will recognize that this data set is a replication data set in support of our article that we had published. If there are any additional notes, that can be included here, as well as the depositor information. So I have encountered situations where a research assistant was the one responsible for entering the data, and at a later time, if you wanted to see who was responsible for depositing that information is retained in the record. And then as you scroll down, this is where you'll have the opportunity to load your files. You have a little plus icon where you can select your data set or drag and drop, or there's a plugin to connect from Dropbox. I'm gonna go and navigate to my data set on my drive. I downloaded it from Google or Google Drive, and I'm gonna actually just drag and drop it. And I had a compressed file that I just dropped in there. And as Jane had noted, Dataverse will accept uploads of compressed files like a zip or a .tar file bundle, and it will automatically unpack your single zip file package. So if I had multiple files and other folder structures and I wanted to retain that, I could have double zipped my data set. I won't go into the details. Again, these are, as Jane noted, I think the maximum file size loading for each data set is 3 gigabytes. Mine were certainly underneath that file size. If you have many separate data files or metadata that you would like to upload or create or populate a data set or Dataverse with, there is an advanced API functionality which can support batch uploads. But I recommend, we're not going to go over that today. I only had 3 files. I recommend consulting the Advanced Dataverse User Guide or contact your institutional Dataverse support, and ask for more information. One of the features that I particularly am fond of in Dataverse is that you can actually add tags to your data set. So if I click here, in a separate CSV file, I had chosen to create my data dictionary, and I can kind of specify that it wasn't my data file, that was the documentation. And my data set here, topical classification, was indeed my data set. I tried to maintain good file naming practices so that when I read the file name, I kind of have an indication of what I'm looking at. But you can also add additional description of what is the file. Not within this case because I have opening access to this data set, but a feature from Dataverse I also appreciate is that you can restrict access to them. So now you'll see that there are little lock icons. They are green because I'm logged in, but if you were an end user on the outside and this data set was published, you would see like a little red lock. So that allows you to maintain who has access to those data sets. Oops, pardon me, I'm going to unrestrict access to these data sets. Now I'm going to click Save. I'll give it a moment. And now what this has done is actually, it's created my data set. It is not yet published. So it is locked for processing while it still uploads some of the information. So just as a highlight, you can see the title, you can see my data citation, the description that I gave, the subject and keywords, as well as a link to the related publication and the metadata. And that was part of limited metadata fields that we did enter. A best practice, and if I click here under Edit Data Set and return to that metadata entry, is to provide as much metadata as possible to support discovery and reuse of your data set. And now that I've entered into this metadata fields, if I scroll down, you'll see there's a breadth of new fields that have become available to me to populate if I so choose. Production date, for instance, was this affiliated to a specific grant? What's the distribution date? What is the kind of data? Is it affiliated to a series? What were the data sources? And you also have disciplinary specific metadata fields if that's pertinent to your domain. So if this were in the social sciences and humanities, I have specific metadata elements that I could add in as well. So what's the control operation, response rate, etc. In two sources, because I am not going to be adding in the wealth of this metadata today, I wanted to draw attention to from the Alliance, or formerly known as Portage, have made available metadata best practices guides on Zenodo, as well as a curation best practice guide. And referring to those would help support your deposit as well into Dataverse. So I'm going to save the changes even though I didn't make any modifications to the metadata. And what I also wanted to highlight again were the permissions, as Jane had alluded to. Depositing data in Dataverse supports collaboration. So if I go into the permissions of the dataset, I can see presently that the system administrator and the University of Ottawa administrator have assigned roles to support the deposit of my data, and so do I. But I can also assign roles to others, be that an administrator, a contributor plus, a curator, a file downloader, or a member. And this specifies what permissions or functionalities they would have within your data set. So given that Jane is a co-author with me, I would like to ensure that she has access to this data set. And I see she has two accounts. I suspect one is her administrator account and one is her end user account. I'm going to hopefully guess that is her end user account. And I'm going to actually assign administrator role. Yes, Jane, I'm going to give you admin permissions and click Save Changes. Now these can be revoked at any time. So if, let's say, my project did have a bunch of research assistants and their relationship to the project changed over time, I can remove those permissions and set those. So those are now live. I can go back to my data set. Another neat feature that I found very useful myself when I've been engaging deposits with Dataverse is creating a private URL. So a private URL allows those without a Dataverse account to access an unpublished data set. So again, as Jane noted, once your data set is published, it's publicly discoverable, but at this time, it is still yet to be published. I can create a private URL and send this to someone who does not have a Dataverse account so that they can view my metadata records as is. That may be helpful for sharing it with a partner or another collaborator who at such time doesn't have an account. I'm going to disable this and just cancel it because we don't need this for today. Again, a key feature that I do appreciate is being able to get data set metrics here, 0 downloads, it's yet to be published. But those are great to share so that I can keep an eye on the use of this. And the last thing I wanted to note, I can delete my data set until such a time that it's been published. I'm not doing that today because I've put in some effort. And before I press publish, some institutions have set up a mediated deposit service, and that is how it is configured here at the University of Ottawa. So when I click publish, again, I'm going to be prompted to make sure that I want to do this. Again, once it's published, the data set cannot be released. It could be deexceptioned, but this is just making sure that you are ready to publish your data set. I'm going to press continue and publish in progress. The data set is locked while the persistent identifier is being registered, as well as our database administrator will be getting a notification to review the data set to publish it. And that is, in a nutshell, how simple it is to provide metadata, deposit your files, and make your data set available in Dataverse. I hope that demystified the process. And if you have any questions, I'm happy to hear it. I am going to return back to sharing our screen for just a moment so that you can have additional contact information on our behalf. I just have to now find the presentation I had.
I'll be sending out a copy of the slides to everyone after the session as well, Chantal, so they will have your
perfect
contact information.
Well, as a closing remark, I will stop sharing my screen then of my PowerPoint.
Thanks so much, Jane and Chantal, for such an interesting overview of Dataverse. And there are so many tips and tricks that I think new users and more seasoned users alike will really appreciate and be helpful. It's always good to have a refresher too. I thought maybe I would just kick off the question period with just a question that I have that I think maybe is good to kind of get the ball rolling. I was wondering if you have any anecdotes about helping researchers in using Dataverse. How have you demystified the process of sharing data with them? Do you have anything to share with us?
Do you want to go first, Jane?
Okay. I haven't found it, I found it easy to demystify the process because there are so many help guides there to help them do it. And the
Right.
biggest challenge I found is helping them set up the Dataverse. And then I go through the metadata fields and I just emphasize the importance of filling them in. So it's just going through that information with them and offering to help them anytime they need it. I've only ever had a researcher come back to me a second time with help doing it. And apart from that, any requests I get for unusual requests, well, I forward to Scholars Portal, and you folks are really good about helping us out. And I just want to mention one particular use case we have, which is really neat. We have a prof in architecture, and every term he teaches it in the fall and winter term. He has the students go out and they have to do an architectural drawing of a historical building. So he has put these into Dataverse so that they can all look at everyone else's drawings, and it's really quite fascinating what he's got in there. But he's not allowed to make it public because if someone happens to download one of the drawings and uses it for an official purpose, well, it could create a real issue with the student and with a lot of other people. But that's just another use that this prof has done with Dataverse, and we weren't sure how it would work out. And he's doing it now for the 3rd year. So he's just totally thrilled with doing it.
I would say for myself, it's been an opportunity to demystify the process of engaging with Dataverse. Is not onerous. It's very simple and user-friendly. I do talk to a researcher that a lot of the work comes in preparing your data set to deposit. So preparing file formats, the associated metadata, if you need to transform your data set into a different data format, for instance, that is where the bulk of the work comes in. But just as you saw, within a span of 10-15 minutes, my data set was prepared and I had my metadata already conceptualized, and going in to just fill in those elements was very quick. So being able to deposit my data in Dataverse for me as a user is very user-friendly. It's just supporting them early on when they engage in the research process to think about, if you're going to be making your data available publicly, what steps do you need to take along your research project so that you're ready at the end of your project. You've documented your step process, you've thought of that through.
That's really great. And I think that's key, is kind of helping researchers see at the beginning of the research process where they want to end up, and then they can kind of map out their steps to get there, rather than after the fact realizing, oh, I didn't get permission to share these data or other kinds of issues as well. So that's really key. Thanks for sharing those anecdotes for sure. So we're starting to get lots of questions in the Q&A, and I've also answered a few as well, just sort of typing in the Q&A as well. I don't know if there's any, Jen, do you think that we should also mention live? Noticed any that maybe you're good to?
Yeah, so there's one that, there's some general questions here that I think are probably good for everyone.
Yeah, okay.
So one that came in was, is Dataverse recommended as a place for working or active data? Because it's recommended as a collaborating tool, it seems to imply using Dataverse for working data. Is that accurate?
Yeah, so I did answer this really quickly, but Jane and Chantal, please feel free to jump in too. I just mentioned that there are really flexible permissions. So that's one benefit that some researchers might be coming up against in trying to collaborate with researchers from other institutions or even people outside of academia. Anyone can create a Dataverse account and then be added to that specific data set in order to collaborate and prepare data for publication. And some people have used it for that sort of unpublished state of the data set for a while to get their data kind of ready. So in that sense, you can use it in that stage, but it really is meant to be sort of that publishing and sharing platform. And once you do publish it, then you can track all of the version changes that you make from that point on. So if you change metadata or change your files, Dataverse will track all of those changes, but in the unpublished state, it doesn't track those changes. So that's one thing to consider as well. Do you have anything to add, Jean or Chantal, about
No, I
that
think you covered
collaborative
it
piece?
quite well. And I've seen
Yeah.
that as well, where they've worked in the back end to prepare it and then release it. And you reminded me, Megan, that I didn't go into that given that I wasn't making a lot of version edits in our data deposit, but I've had deposit data sets in the past where I've made versions that tracked it for me. And I was like, oh, this is great. Like,
It's really great, and the feature that allows you to kind of compare versions too, I think is really helpful for people who've forgotten what they've done, or maybe other people on their team have made changes and they can go back and check those too. So I guess one question that came up, maybe I'll just answer that quickly too, that's come up a few times, is about, can researchers sign up for a Dataverse account and deposit data if their institution does not subscribe currently? So that's a really good question. And I did mention just before that anyone can create an account. You don't need to be affiliated with an institution to create an account, but our Scholars Portal Dataverse is organized by institution. So if you don't have an affiliation, you won't automatically be affiliated with an institution and then be able to deposit according to their permissions and policies. But you could collaborate with a research group who already has permission or a space to deposit. But the service is growing, so we're up to 59 institutions across Canada, and we're also actively developing new models for other types of organizations to join in the academic world. So if your institution isn't subscribed yet, maybe they can subscribe for sure. And really the idea here is that we need to have those partnerships to ensure sustainability of our repository. That's what drives sort of our growth and ability to develop it as well. And then also that those institutions are so key in that sort of process of curating the data if they're doing that, or having policies for long-term access and preservation too. So that's what the model that we've had so far. So we need to really be considering that as well. So I just wanted to address that live in case anyone was curious.
And is there's a cost associated with institutional membership?
Yeah, so currently with the institutional memberships are organized by the 4 library consortia across Canada. So COPL, OCL, BCI, and CAL. And so they would be the people that you would contact and if you wanted to join, if you're part of that library consortia. And they'll have all the details. And if you would like, I can help with that afterwards too, if you want to get contact details about how to contact for that. Great. Are there any other questions that look like I can tackle together?
There's a lot of questions about kind of what's kept, what's restricted, what kind of embargoes there are. So maybe let's tackle the question, I think, to start with of can you restrict data sets and can you embargo data sets?
So currently for embargoes, they are done manually. So you might have an institutional administrator who can put in basically keep your data set unpublished to a certain point and then you publish it, sort of a manual process. But we're hearing that in the latest version of Dataverse coming out, there will be automatic embargoes that can be put in place. So once we upgrade to that version, that will be really exciting to be able to say that we can offer this as well. So when you have your data set unpublished, then it is completely restricted. No one can find it or search for it. But you can create a private URL if you need to share it with somebody for, say, the purposes of a review of a publication or something like that. And that private URL you can keep active for as long as you like, and then you can turn it off as well. So I think that was one of the questions that came up.
Mm-hmm.
And you can restrict individual files, as Chantel showed as well. And you can decide if you give access to certain people on a very granular level as well.
I would say I've seen in Dataverse, the documentation or the metadata was unrestricted or kept open, and the data set itself was restricted. I didn't go into those features as well, but there are advanced features there as well where you can enable request access. So if the data set is locked, you can have a feature where the end user can click request access and that prompts notification. There's even guestbook features. But I wanted to leave time for questions today. It's really fun to dig into Dataverse, and in that demo set, like I said, that is available to you, and go play around with those features.
Oh, and it's great. I see Philip Durbin noted in the chat here that the embargo feature has been merged and will be in the next release. So that's fantastic. So it will be in the next release, like we said, and you can see it's a feature that's very requested here in Canada. We've heard about it a lot, so we don't have to worry about the manual kind of process.
So what happens when the data set is published? Is that private URL then removed? That's no longer a thing?
Yes.
Okay. That was an easy answer. A question about licensing. Is it possible to assign different licenses to different versions? I guess different versions of a data set or different versions of or does one license apply to everything?
That's a good question.
I've seen one license. I've seen it done, and this is, I'm maybe not the
Yeah.
expert here to respond to this, but within that Dataverse, the version is tracked, and I don't think you can assign a different license to each version, but I've seen a different use case where someone created a Dataverse and chose to deposit different items within the research project as different data sets, and those
Okay.
had different licenses attached to them.
Yeah, I'd have to test that out a little bit. I'm not entirely sure off the top of my head.
So I can imagine there's a way to engage in the Dataverse platform based on that use case. Talk to your local institutional Dataverse administrator.
Yes. And that's a great example of something I would immediately go to the demo Dataverse and try that out and see if it's possible and what the restrictions are there. I mean, if it's possible, like say you did publish a data set and you realized it's the wrong license, you could then perhaps deaccession that version and then have another version that has the appropriate license, for example. That could be one workaround, but I'd have to check into that more. So we'll follow up about that.
Okay, so I think a question that's on a lot of people's minds with the requirement to deposit data coming up, can a data set contain sensitive information as long as it remains restricted?
Oh, this restricted data is a huge can of worms. And yeah, so we're going to need to be looking more in detail about this and some of the initiatives that are happening at the Dataverse organization, like the larger community as well, around sensitive data tags and trusted remote storage agents and all sorts of things like that. But currently we have in our sort of terms of use and our sort of FAQs and everything like that we don't accept sensitive data that has personally identifiable information as a sort of policy level kind of thing, but you can restrict files. And so there is the possibility to have restricted data that you can control in your data set. So that's sort of where we are, but I definitely want you to stay tuned because we're going to be looking more into this sensitive data issue. Right now, there aren't a lot of options for Canadian researchers to store and share sensitive data. So it's a huge gap in our infrastructure landscape. And so we're going to be looking for possibilities and maybe some pilot projects as well to look into that. I hope that answers the question as best as I can with this sort of strange stage, but
I think I can also add what Alicia Capello wrote in the chat is that although they can be restricted, they don't follow specific IT norms for protecting sensitive confidential data, which would require your files to be encrypted, and that is not currently available. I'm reading what's in the chat.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's one of the things we've been doing. Alicia's been so helpful with the CTS project across Canada, the Core Trust Seal certification, and developing policies that can be used at the Scholars Portal Dataverse level, and then helping institutions develop their documentation to put together an application. So we do have some new documents that will be coming out that will outline more of these sort of like info security type things so you'll have a better idea of what the system's capable of. So, but we do need to work on the policies and the governments and all that. So it's to be determined. It's a tough one.
Yeah.
And I'm sure you guys are getting questions, Jane and Chantal, about this kind of work from researchers as well. Yeah. Great.
Well, I'm seeing no other questions. So I think this might be a good time to wrap up. Megan, did you have anything you wanted to finish off with, or?
No, I just wanted to say thank you so much to Chantal and Jane and for everyone here. And just to remind you that there are a few other webinars in the series. Maybe I'll put a link in the chat. So please, unless this has already gone out there, I missed it. Please come to the other series and continue the conversation. Lots of other interesting things to hear about use cases and lots of things from across Canada. So thanks again.
Thank you,
Yeah,
everyone.
there are more in this series, and I will just point out as well that there are a couple of webinars coming up from CAUL, the Council of Atlantic University Libraries. One is tomorrow, which you may want to attend, on where to deposit your data, Dataverse, Further, or Other, which will then be presented again next week en français. And the links to those are in the chat as well. I noticed that the link to the survey went up in the chat, and I have not updated that yet. So if you go there and don't see the webinar that you're in, don't panic. I will try to put it up there. It's been a bit of a crazy week, a couple of weeks around here on the webinar.
So many webinars.
That's okay, Beth. Thank you all so much for joining us today. Thanks to our wonderful moderator, Megan, and our presenters, Chantal and Jane, and hope to see you again in a couple of weeks for our panel session. Take care until then.